Why don't we open it up for questions? Would anyone like to comment? Yes.
So, I very much enjoyed your presentation. Thank you for that. And, this wasn't necessarily the thrust of your presentation, but I found it interesting, some of the cognitive differences that you highlighted and Stacy highlighted in terms of, positive changes versus negative changes. And I think it does tie back to research design, and which you both talked about too, but I just wonder if you can comment on some of the cross-sectional designs maybe versus what Stacy's doing and how we maybe can tease apart cause and effect on down the road.
I think this is critical to do prospective longitudinal studies, also to do animal studies, really to follow what we know is the tried and true path for de-risking medications, for understanding dose range and early efficacy. To move forward with that. I think some of the longitudinal studies suffer from low completer rates, right? So in Stacy's trial, she started with 28, but had data on 11. I think that's evolving. We're going to have more soon. But I think that these better funded trials that are able to be longer will help us with that. I think the ABCD trial will be very important, although that's observational. So randomized trials, and Stacy was the first really to call our attention to the fact that adolescents may be at particular risk, and I have a real ethical problem with randomizing adolescents to cannabinoids, maybe cannabidiol, but THC products, certainly younger adolescents, I'm not prepared to do that because I think the risk is too high.
I'll just say this one thing. I'm probably not appropriately credited with that, but thank you, Eden. One really important difference, since I spent a long time looking at the impact of recreational cannabis on the brain and cognitive performance, really important thing to keep in mind is these kids are neurodevelopmentally immature. So they're at a period of development. Your brain is still under construction, so to speak, right? We tell them they're a work in progress. The difference between those folks over time and through lots of different studies with colleagues across the country and really the world, we've all sort of reported those types of findings. Whether or not they hold up sort of in the aggregate is a little bit of a different story, but the cross-sectional studies are different from the longitudinal studies. The medical marijuana program that the data that I showed you from that looks as if some of the cognitive performance is improving, perhaps as a function of the fact that these folks are older. The average age of those participants, about 49. They're also using products that are not necessarily high in THC. Many of them are using products that are specifically high in CBD. And their indications and reasons for use are very different. The goal is not to get high, but to feel better from the medical marijuana patient. So I think all those things have to be kept in mind when we think about the data. We certainly need a lot more of it. Just to your point, we do have more people in the mind to that observational study. We just hadn't had the rest of them come through their visit two yet, but we're hopeful. We'll see how it goes.
Dr. Evans, you were a reviewer on the report. Can you talk a little bit about the review process and specifically how comments were incorporated and how much the report changed as it went on?
Have to answer that.
I will say it was a privilege to be able to review the report.
Other comment? Lee, do you have questions? Yeah.
Okay, I have several questions from the web that's really to the whole panel. Let's see, I'm trying to think of where to start. Many medical marijuana patients are concerned about the new administration's stance on marijuana use and research. Do you have any thoughts about where this would lead for medical marijuana patients?
I'm probably best to speak on that. I think at least, it's an uneducated thought. I mean, across the industry, it's very unknown, and there's quite a bit of angst actually, depending on how that's going to play out. I think the comments that have come from the president during the election, as well, were open to the state programs. State rights was an issue that was something that was the Republican Party candidates were generally in favor of. And so there's a general thought that things will stay the same. And at least the other thing that's important is with Attorney General Sessions' confirmation, there was some concern as to his approach, because I referenced it in my talk. The Cole memo came out of DOJ. Now you have Attorney General Sessions there. And so once again, there is some hesitation in the industry, but if you look at the comments during the hearing panel, there's nothing that he said that I would say is in any way inconsistent with a continuation of the current policy. So long story short, to a medical marijuana patient, my general thought would be that the programs will continue in their current form. No acceleration, but at the same time, no federal involvement, but that could change at any moment, as we probably all know.
Okay. The next question was submitted a couple times, so I want to make sure I get it in. It's from Bogota, Colombia. Will the FDA review the cannabis products and accept your therapeutic recommendations? As a healthcare provider, where can we find information about legal support and legal cannabis providers? The FDA page is not helpful.
It's a great question. I'm not sure that any one of us necessarily is equipped to answer that. I think the FDA has been open to receiving lots of different information from lots of different avenues, so to speak. I'm not clear on their dissemination routes. I'm not sure how they disseminate that information, but they're certainly open to hearing about information. At least with our submission for a clinical trial, they were.
And I think I would add that, at least right now, there's a difference between the federal government and its agencies and the individual states. And I think the question was about guidance from the federal agencies, FDA in particular. And so there's not much there. There is something on NIDA's website, on the FDA's, and there's some on DEA. Actually, there was a lawsuit recently that to force the DEA to update theirs where it was accurate with results at the time. But in general, if someone were looking for guidance, that's going to be in the state programs, not the federal. As in my talk, I mentioned the federal government right now stance is there is no acceptable use.
Are the products noted in Dr. Scott and Dr. Evans' presentations also tested for pesticides? If so, do the eastern states have consistent limits for their pesticides?
That's a great question, and not to my knowledge. I think the lack of consistency is what's consistent at this point. There's a patchwork of states. As Teddy sort of quipped, every state's its own country. So I know Massachusetts is just starting to work out its rules for recreational marijuana, and so what will be allowed.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. It's that each state is very different, and this is one of the important things that the federal government could step in without supporting medical cannabis, while still keeping the regulatory framework in place. The different agencies could step in to standardize certain things for safety, pesticide usage, for example. It's actually one of the things that the states struggle with all the time is to be EPA compliant. It has to be something that's a federally approved use. But guess what? Cannabis is not a federally approved use. So how do you deal with pesticide usage? But in general, it is one of those areas that the federal government could step in.
And I would say that the presence of fungus is even potentially of much greater importance of immunocompromised patients that are taking it. Yeah.
Okay, I hope I get this one correctly. What would you recommend as basic regulations for medical use of CBD for epilepsy in a country with no legalization of medical use and requests from associations of mothers of children with epilepsy? Hope that made sense.
Is there a policy expert in the room? I don't think we're equipped to answer that question either.
I mean, the only thing I would say to that is that, at least to my understanding, is, the research is that THC is the only component in cannabis that is psychoactive, or the predominant one. There's definitely some metabolites of THC that are psychoactive, but so long as you have some type of a purified substance that is not known to be psychoactive, and to my knowledge, CBD is not known.
CBD is psychoactive. It's just not liable to be abused.
Okay. That the abuse potential, the risk of CBD are not nearly in the same stratification as THC, and so perhaps it is something that could be looked at differently.
I would hope the DEA would have very little interest in CBD. Right.
Kelsey?
There's another policy-related question from the web. It says, speakers in this session have done a great job addressing the funding and policy issues around conducting good research, particularly on the therapeutic side. But what about research that can inform on-the-ground policies legalizing cannabis for medical or retail use? Can anyone on the panel speak to what they might recommend for improving both state and national surveillance, both through population-based surveys and syndromic surveillance, to answer priority questions about health effects and policy?
It's a great question, and actually I think that there's a lot to be done with regard to increasing surveillance efforts. So currently there's no mandate that individuals who are using for recreational necessarily or medical, depending on what state you're in, are registered with, let's say, these large-scale registries that exist in some places but not in others. For current recreational users, for example, in Massachusetts, where we've just passed legislation but we don't yet have the implementation of the law, there's a lot of discussion about a mandatory registry. Mandatory registries at least give you some semblance of what people are doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, et cetera. I think that's one step in terms of states. I think there have been efforts within states for individuals to create study programs like that, but mandating them by state is certainly one way that we could increase what we know about what people are using, why they're using, and how they're using, which is going to be critical, especially in states with recreational cannabis legislation.
Because we don't understand, we know very little about escalation of use. When people begin using medically, do they develop cannabis use disorders? Are there subgroups who do and some who don't? So you really could begin to track escalation of use, et cetera, if done correctly. And it could be HIPAA compliant and anonymized, essentially. But this would be so important, along with standard testing of what's being sold and what are the constituents of the products being sold.
This also, just really quickly, would give you an idea. I mean, again, this is a very, very small pilot study that we published from the MIND program, but we did see a very dramatic decrease in opiate use. The opiate crisis is epidemic in this country, and if in fact this is something to be explored with further study, we need to take a closer look at that. Mandating registry patients or individuals who are certified for use for recreational or medical use would actually give us some really important information with regard to other medications, other conditions, et cetera. So. Right,
so the registry could be linked to prescription databases so that you could actually look in a anonymized but person-by-person basis whether cannabis use went up and stayed up and opiate use stayed up, or opiate use went down. We really don't know what's going on.
And just one thing I'll add is, at least currently in the state of New York, the patient registry is tied to the prescription monitoring program. And there's an opportunity as states continue to come on. Pennsylvania, which is enacting their regulations and their program this year, is interesting. They're the first state that is actively pushing the medical schools in the state to collaborate and partner with the businesses. And you also have Ohio and Florida, which recently passed their laws. Once again, these states, as part of their regulatory system, could take the current system in New York and take it even one step further, where the businesses, I mean, we have the systems in place right now. It's one more piece of data that we could collect or put the infrastructure in place to interact with the physicians and the healthcare systems.
I have a question for you to follow up. Does the state of New York, is the dispensary data linked to the prescription monitoring program for opiates or for all prescriptions?
I'm not sure. I believe it's certainly for controlled substances. There's no doubt about that.
Because
I'm
it would
just
be
not sure
great
if
to
it's
link
all.
it to antidepressant use, antispasmodic, all sorts of things. To really link it to the prescriber database. That would be possible as well.
Leah, did you have one? Okay. Kelsey?
Again, from the internet, we have a couple questions related to scheduling. One says, it seems everyone agrees that there should be more study on and large-scale research. Is there or is there not enough evidence to make the argument that the Schedule I rating should be changed? And similarly, what is the likelihood of CBD specifically to be rescheduled off of Schedule I by the federal government in the near future? Or is policy related to CBD tied to cannabis overall?
I'm going to answer just real quickly. Just one thing on that is, with regards to scheduling, I would agree with what Edie said earlier. Currently, and it might be surprising to people in my industry, I would say currently there is not enough evidence to change the scheduling. However, it's what I would suggest is the problem is not the evidence, it's the test. The hurdle that must be cleared for descheduling is almost impossible to clear. So once again, I would suggest there's not enough evidence to deschedule, but the test is inherently wrong.
I think that's very well put. That revamping. I think Stacy gave her wish list of the flow chart of how it could be made easier. So the fact that it's Schedule I, I think we need some evidence that it's safe and effective long term to reschedule the drug, and that may be an unpopular position, but that's what I think. But to just because it's Schedule I, it doesn't need to be so hard to study.
The one thing I would say, and just in addition to sort of follow up on both of your comments, just for folks who are really sort of clueless about the fact that they really don't understand why things that are potentially non-psychoactive and have no potential for diversion sit in the same schedule as other substances or constituents from the plant that are. And I think this is something that's going to bear a lot more discussion, because a lot of people are pushing for that in particular, given, again, the potential medical benefit. It's difficult to study, so you can't study it necessarily to accumulate the evidence that you need to move past some of the regulatory hurdles. So it's a little bit of a catch-22.
And I'd like to add one follow-up, because I know I'm going to catch a lot of flack from peers in my industry from my comments, is that it's the history. Cannabis, when the Controlled Substance Act was put in place back in the 60s, cannabis was put on Schedule I from the very beginning with very little evidence to put it there. And the problem is that the standards to move it are almost impossible to meet. So my answer is, once again, I may have my own personal belief of where it should be, but at least if you correctly and accurately apply the test, there's not enough yet to move it.
Steve?
Just a brief comment, and I just wanted to reinforce really some of the discussion that had been going on with the questions in the panel here, is that there were recommendations from the report that really included some major discussions and collaborations with various organizations around research methods, and surveillance. So the committee recognized that this is something that we really need to work on, and I think we're basically hearing it from the choir as well.
Anyone else?